Nobody, Never, Nowhere by Linda Marie Väli. Translated by Martin Luiga. Edited by Marcia, Allass. I dedicate this book to Holden Caulfield and to every other miserable soul that has still retained any sense and sensitivity. Tranquilized by the daily television program, they are living corpses, lost to all except consumption. Terence McKenna. 1. I am going to tell you a little bit about our lives. Believe it or not, we even had a cat. We called her Pikili because she was black and loved to sing. And she really belonged to us, while the house itself belonged to some business bozo, whose pointless existence, a pity, became known to us only afterwards. Of course we didn't think that the house was entirely without an owner, because in this world everything belongs to somebody, even the trees in the forest. Every dummy knows that. But we hoped that all kinds of owners had long forgotten about this pathetic shack, for it was pathetic. Broken windows boarded up, a hole in the roof, the chimney halfway sunken through the eternite, etc., etc., etc. But that was a first-glance pitifulness, a petty bourgeois pitifulness. By our standards, the house was even the best of the best. One can always repair the windows, and the hole in the roof was not all that big, really. After all, we had been looking for a house like this for months, a house in a condition that would be enough so it could be lived in, but at the time deserted enough so that no one else would want to live there. What so? We were basically squatters, voluntary homeless people. There were 4 of us, no more or less since the beginning until the end, and our problem was that we did not want to live at home or go to school anymore. The old ones can call it a regular teenage crisis or a hard case of puberty or whatever, but it was a different case with us. We were actually being repressed. And who knows? Probably the old ones were also repressed once, those that are wrinkly now and suck. They were truly repressed, with force, all the pressure that the society has to give. But it follows that, in the end, they managed to still break them, because look, the desire for more good, more just, and more wise has been completely extinguished within them. While the corpse of that same desire is rotting in the memories of elders, transforming into the basest kind of drivel and cliché, some rebellious youth which makes its way into every soul, but in the end, thank heaven, leaves it still, only that one can't be late with dampening that rebellion, because then life would be fucked, as the already more cynical and straight-spoken, though rotten-souled, mothers, fathers, and grandmothers would note. But understand this, we were not going to agree to all those dictates and frames which force us to wear a jacket like that and talk a talk that's like that, by God. This is all just so base and awful. And besides, our teachers are people that should be nobody's role models, and whose heads are devoid of room for anything else than buying and selling, all that economy. And now they want to fill our heads with exactly the same trash. No and no again, we said to this trash, to leave all of that crap. Truly sorry, but I cannot leave this word untold or even unrepeated. In a word, to leave all that crap behind us. Thus, I would like to tell you about that life of ours. I would like to tell it as well or poorly as I can, and I would be grateful if you would take the trouble of hearing me out. It does not matter whether you are old or young, rich or poor, whatever. Because even if I do hate you over your ideas, worldview, ignorance, and spiritual blindness, and if I do berate you over that, you should not take it very personally. These kinds of battles are held in the realm of ideals, but one may beat, stab, and burn on the ideals, while one may never do so with humans, animals, or other living creatures. So understand, I am not berating you, but only what your way of living is doing to the world. In the end, I am also not some greatest role model in the world, and you may berate me likewise. Actually, I only want to tell you how we lived, why and what happened to us then. because I believe that there may be some point to that telling. Of course, there might also not be, but this is for you to decide after the fact. I just want to tell you how much we cared, as no one cared about us or our caring, of nothing we held dear, or still do. You know, I recently asked Fred, when we were climbing at the Jolly Fellows in the Old Town, got tired, and then went to rest in an emptied outhouse. It's right on the corner of the Fellows, just above the hill, and by the way, it would make a fine squad. I asked about what he thinks, how to conclude all that which we did back then, all that we were. And imagine, he looked at me with a long glance, somewhat mockingly, and in the end he said, with an evil half-smile, although there was tenderness mixed into that malice, "Dear Maria, you know the answer yourself. You know it very well. What did we do in the end? Who were we? I'll tell you. We were going nowhere. We never got there. We were no ones. A bunch of losers. Nobodies." 2. One morning, Freddie announced, Enough of this slacking around and healthy human laziness. We had been vegetating at our lovely little house for about 2 weeks already, pondering about some plastering and other works, but mere pondering it had remained. And this is why Fred finally had enough. "Let's be honest, we'll become bums in no time," he vociferated, while the rest of us hid inside our thick sleeping bags and heated an instant noodle soup on a tiny camping stove. Everyone's noses were blue on their face and hands wintry, because it was, at a generous estimate, 10 or 11 degrees in the room. And behind the windows that had been broken by storms or men, the thick house forest was still freezing in the calm breath of March. "Look around yourself. It's not even bohemian anymore." We truly had to agree that Fred had a point there, and we observed with interest how the wind, which blew in from the empty window frames, rustled around the garbage on the dusty floor. Those shreds of paper and plastic bore a memory of the former residents of the house, but also bore witness to the influence of the new owners, us. The undertone of it all was still somehow somber, because those new owners hadn't yet anyhow shown themselves to be worthy of this property. Freddie carped bitterly on. "We simply must do something about it, otherwise it all becomes completely pointless, and we may just as well go back home right away." And we all crouched even closer to the camping stove to warm ourselves, while the steam rising from the instant noodle pot danced in the background of the dark and embarrassing silence of the room. Like I said, we had vegetated at that dilapidated building for almost 2 weeks by then, doing nothing, and having eaten ourselves actually sick from the discount trash food. Discount so we could hold on to our meager and communal money reserves for as long as possible. With the imagined end to money, our visions of the future also ended, although some vague hope did not. Me, Ten, and Agnes had gone out very rarely, preferring the shady cover of the crumbling shack, while only Freddie, who had turned 17 already and whose parents didn't care anyhow, snuck out from time to time, so the neighboring souls wouldn't notice the new and forbidden habitation, to get necessary supplies from the stores, usually just foodstuffs and drinks, cigarettes, and sometimes also the cheapest fruit wine. The rest of us just couldn't leave. We were true runaways, who had deserted both their homes and their parents. And we could bet all the 3 napes between us that the cops were searching for us a long time already. By God, just like prisoners that had escaped from a forced labor camp. We had left behind 3 letters. 3 exhaustive, explanatory, and cursing letters. But that was all. We could be sure that such letters would tell our parents no more than the stones in the street, or the birds in the sky. But at least we tried. No one can accuse us of giving up on them. Those 2 sad and idle weeks we had spent in some kind of depression mixed with fear. A general sorrow, but not without a sort of stubbornness and willpower. Otherwise, we would have just stayed at home. But the stubbornness and will had not helped us to put an end to that still life yet. I can't even say exactly why such lethargy had overtaken us. Why were we unable to make a single move to improve our life in general? When I think back on it, I would guess the reason was in some general value judgments. We had, after all, said no to our petty bourgeois parents, to school and to societal pressure in general. We had said no and escaped it all, but it itself had not escaped our souls yet, or our lack of such. Under it, I mean that belief that our caretakers had forced upon us since birth, that only recognizes houses and apartments whose toilets are sterile, living rooms properly wallpapered and with soft and wide beds and couches all around. Unknowingly, it might have seemed to us that in such a ruined, moldy, powerless, and waterless shack, one should, in fact, live like the homeless people who wriggle around in their own urine behind the Baltic station. I think that it seemed impossible to us that we could start a life whose foundations would resemble any cleanliness, order, and well-being, just by ourselves, with merely our own hands and heads and nothing else, in such a deserted and forgotten hut. Our souls were truly rebellious, but our bodies were, despite that, too spoiled and ninnyish, the usual sickly kids of the modern age, all show and no go. And at the moment, those sickly kids were crouching around the camping stove that had been filched from Agnes's dad and pondering whatever should be done so a random deserted hutch could become a home to them. "A loo," I finally said, and the others lifted their eyes in surprise from the steaming instant noodle pot. I winced meaningfully and explained, "For certain we do lack a loo. If we want to keep on living here, we could at least have a proper loo, not that awful smelly bucket downstairs." The others started snickering at that, and Agnes shouted passionately that I am darn right. Imagine this. The flashlight died on me last night when I was looking for that bucket, and I almost stepped into it, she moaned, so that Tun was coughing with laughter. "But I bet there is something that stinks worse than that bucket," I said, while twisting my face in awful ways. "And that would be us. Without a doubt, we ourselves smell 100 times worse. Believe you me." Now Tun was laughing so heartily that his nose was bursting with snot. We had all been tortured by rhinitis due to that unending cold. But Agnes made a prissy and disturbed face, and told us that this was not at all her fault. "I have dreamt of a proper bath more than anything else, and this accounts for all the days," she exclaimed. "I am so dirty and so cold as I haven't been in my lifetime. I no longer even remember how it was when my parts weren't stiff from cold." Agnes pressed her lips into a line and let out a forced sigh, but then Freddie suddenly went red in the face and smashed his fist against the floor. "God damn it," he swore. "Let's go home then, shall we, if it's so cold and nasty? Let's throw all those damn ideas into the rubbish. Let's grow up and go home again. Is that what you want? This all won't help us anyhow if we're the worst sissies that can't get anything done by themselves. All we can do is whine, nothing else. And truth be told, this is not at all how I imagined it, with all the stinking and the silent decline." After that, everyone fell morbidly silent again, because Fred's accusations chafed on the soul, and in the end, everyone had to admit to themselves that they did think about giving up and going back home in the coldest and most miserable moments. Or at least I did, but probably the others did as well. Actually, it was the basest sort of homesickness. There was nothing genuine in it. It was a pure desire for comforts to be bought and sold, the warmth of rooms, eternal water, and proper food. And who would stop us from living like the worst of the consumer society's maniacs? No one. Everyone would have only congratulated that choice. Parents, teachers, and society alike. But the question was still whether we truly wanted it, or were just so tired of all that cold, hunger, and fear of police, and also tired of lacking a clear picture of our next actions and how our rebellion will look exactly. The daring of running away from home, that joy and idealism had dissipated. It faded away in the face of the struggles and dullness of real life. But something else had awakened within us, some strange sort of feeling. For the first time in our lives, it seemed to us that we were on the right track, or even that we had struck on some right vein. We were together, and we had an idea, A great and important one. And the only thing that remained a bit murky was the realization of that idea. "I don't think any of us would really want to return home, Freddie," Agnes finally said, and shook her little head to reassert the words. "It's about something else, really. I somehow feel empty when I think about how we could manage by ourselves and make this house here into a great one. I have this feeling, like something from inside me," and she put her palm to her chest, "like something is missing here, as if it was robbed from me. And you know, it has been. I've been robbed of the skills to make it on my own in the world, skills which my parents and their parents, down to lemurs, should have taught me, but didn't. And in the process, they've robbed me of the independence to live by myself. I have the feeling of a half man, who doesn't even know what to do when all the obvious comforts are taken, and who could just die of hunger when the shops once disappear, because she's simply unable to do anything by her own hands." Agnes looked me in the eyes while saying those words as if surprised. What beautiful bluish-gray eyes she had. And I, in turn, turned my eyes to Fred. But his eyes were still hard, and he reclined carelessly on the floor, uncaring of even the dampness and cold, as most of the sleeping bag had slipped from his body onto the floorboards. "What a nice philosophy," he said with a drawl. "But what's the morality of Miss Agnes? Should we abandon all our plans because we're just, excuse me, but too incapable?" "Absolutely not," the girl answered. "I just think we should learn all those things once again, to become a real people." "And besides," Dunn spoke now, having been sitting in nearly complete silence the whole morning, "as there are altogether wholly 4 half-men, as you said, then it makes up no more or less than 2 entirely whole and able people. And that's pretty much already. Let us then presume that you are one of those whole people, and you, as that kind of proper exemplar, could show us right here and right now, as a whole example, how we could also become such upstanding, 100% reasonable, real people," Freddie mocked. But Tunn's face turned haughty at that, and he got on his feet with slow arrogance. "As requested," he spoke solemnly, and started gathering the paper pieces lying on the floor into the dirtiest palm in the world. "That is a living teaching for you. Follow me, yo blind ones, and soon you shall see." He pranced around the room with a mock staggering gait, sometimes bending down for some dirt snippet, and leaving boot sole patterns in the dust while the rest of us snickered as we observed this trickery. "So," Freddie opened his mouth at last, "this type of foolishness, with our snouts in the rubbish, that's going to make us actual people?" "Unlikely," Agnes mused, "but it might be good enough for a start. In addition," she raised her finger as if imitating some great teacher, "from even the smallest tree, a great tree may grow." Freddie laughed at that, and it seemed that his mood was not as dark anymore. We set ourselves around the camping stove as if it was suddenly a real dining table or something, because the trash food soup had done boiling, and now Agnes was dividing the watery portions with a few added potatoes into 4 dirty metal cans, old bean cans repurposed as utensils. I have later thought a lot about Agnes's words on the so-called half-man, and I think she struck at the core of the matter much deeper than Freddie or Agnes herself could imagine. I have almost always felt pretty much exactly the same, a failure, and I have deeply hated the world for not giving me a choice. When I was born and had only started to learn whether I even want to grow into a member of such a weird society, who produce things in factories that they cannot make otherwise, truly only learning to produce money with which to buy those things later. No one asked me what I want, but the decision was made for me by the state, or the society, or whatever it would be called, and to top it all off, not my, but only their interests were considered. At least they could have, when I was still a child, but already understood things a bit, shown me other ways of life, the fields and the handicraft and all that, and later let me myself choose which world I would want in the end, but no. No one has asked me anything, and least of all for permission to make me a pointless, incomplete, and incapable person. But on that long-lost morning, when Fred finally, thank heavens, had enough, because actually we had all had enough already anyhow, on that long-lost morning, things finally started to move, after 2 weeks of stagnation and doubtfulness. Our first job was cleaning up the house, and, it took far more than 1 day to do it. Those who have never been to any dilapidating hovels that have stood empty for years wouldn't even believe the filth and nastiness that covers buildings like that. The ovens have always fallen in and covered the walls with a thick layer of soot. Floors have started composting from the dirt and autumn leaves that have found their way inside. Gross garbage of unknown origin lurks like ugly monsters in the darkest corners of the rooms, etc., etc., etc. And in conclusion, we could even say that maybe getting started is the hardest thing. As in, the start it feels like, come on, honestly, there is nothing to salvage here. But this is where you're wrong. There is always something to salvage, and everything can be salvaged, it's true. That cleanup action of ours finally grew into a truly grand endeavor, which completely buried our lethargy and laziness. A few of the clothes we had taken with us became cleaning rags. Freddie pulled a brand new broom out of somewhere, like from a magician's hat, and all kinds of pry bars and other stuff. So the next week became altogether saturated with constant cleaning and hassle in contrast with the former ones. And in addition to all that, the weather was warming up. March was almost over, and showing an extremely warm face, which was taken by Agnes as a good omen, while Freddie bemoaned the industry and the climate change which caused it, in a shrill voice. However it was, the decline of that awful coldness filled us with new fervor, and the house was slowly becoming. In my mind I already called it my real home, and bit by bit such terms of endearment seeped into the conversations between us. I remember how Agnes invited me into the farthest corner of the yard, waving her hand grandly toward last year's grassland, and said in a half-joking, half-serious manner, we will even grow potatoes here. And we did, though only later, and sadly we never got our teeth to those tubers. To Fred's great joy, me, Agnes, and Ten, carried by the new house spirit, became bolder in general, and soon, at night, the four of us were drifting in the neighborhood, carrying tons of garbage and trash over long kilometers, because Fred didn't want to overflow the neighboring trash containers with this filth, being afraid that it might cause trouble, and in the end, we'd be smoked out of our own home. You can never be too careful, he spoke in those cases, just like some kind of an auntie, and Agnes did call him Auntie Fred as a joke. And although the auntie made a mean face to that, I think in truth he inwardly also laughed at himself. Those first nights on which we sneaked around under cover of darkness like cat burglars and breathed great gasps of true freedom into our lungs, the freedom to live as we thought was right and as we actually wanted, those first nights cast a shadow over the whole of my previous life. I was finally myself, a free and noble soul, and I could do everything, absolutely everything. That omnipotence also went deeper into our ideas and lifestyle, but it's true that the beginning was painful, full of arguing, and intense. I am reminded of one of the first breaks, when Agnes and Ten started to re-evaluate things, of course, thanks to Fred. As for me, all this was not so new anymore. Hard to believe, but that break began with nails and hammer, or more precisely their absence. And the other sad fact that came into play was that despite all of our great economizing, the little money we had was diminishing at a terrifying pace towards nothingness. That morning, or a noon to some, began as usual, We had gathered around a tiny camping stove while the noodle soup or something similar was boiling, and I can bet that at that moment there was a lively discussion on the subject of the house. Maybe we were talking how to collect rainwater with the giant barrel found from the cellar to wash ourselves and other things, both clothes and rooms. Or then the wind generators and building them. Maybe even of a garden bed. Growing potatoes, carrots, and beans? It doesn't really matter. We might have been talking on whatever more or less utopian theme, but at some point the talk went very clearly to the problematics of the roof, and the question of how to patch the yawning hole in the Eternite. Tan had stacked all the boards that had any quality into the living room, and those would have been an ideal fit, but regretfully we had neither a hammer nor nails. No tools whatsoever. I remember how Tan adjusted the soup boiling in the tin bowl with some strange fidget, maybe a pocket knife or just a metal stick, and offered to sneak out on that same day to his parents, while they were still at work, and filch some nails and other stuff from the shed. But no, neither Agnes nor myself liked that idea, as it seemed too dangerous, and furthermore, we still wanted to sever all ties with that former life, and that would not have been that, really. Well, then, the other option is to find someone to borrow money or stuff from. Nah, Freddie grunted. Do you not understand? We just have to learn to manage by ourselves, at least in some capacity. Okay, but what's going to happen then? Soon we won't even have money for food anymore, seriously. Will we then start stealing from shops, or what? Now Freddie raised his head, that had been fully drowned by his hair, and looked at everyone, one by one, with a shrewd face, while slightly nodding. Tan started snickering as if it were a joke, but Freddie turned his mocking face to him and exclaimed, "No kidding. Think of it yourself. This way we could get all the necessary stuff, all by ourselves. You know, from warehouses, building sites, even supermarkets. We could get everything, if we were only handy and careful enough." "What are you saying here?" Agnes inquired with displeasure, while staring at Freddie attentively, as if trying to make sure it wasn't just another joke. But the boy remained serious. "What is all this talk, then?" Agnes repeated, raising her voice. When that sweet little girl got agitated, she couldn't always control her speech or even movements. "I do not agree with stealing. God help us, think a little. You want to start robbing people, Freddie? Is that it? This runs contrary to any proper lifestyle." "No, it doesn't," Freddie stubbornly argued back. "This is a petty bourgeois notion you have anyhow. I didn't say we should take anything from regular people. I'm saying we'd only filch stuff from some businessmen, understand? We'd be doing a favor to the world by lessening the amount of their stuff, because this way they'll go bankrupt sooner and everyone can breathe more easily." "This is a completely fabricated justification," Agnes repined. "You speak of a society based on honesty and responsibility, but now you want to go thieving." "But what should we do then? You said it yourself. All the skills necessary for life have been robbed from us, remember? Well, now we can rob at least some of it back." "Rubbish!" exclaimed the girl. "Our struggle should be different. We should not degenerate to their level if we don't want to do it in the way of some lame revanchists. A tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye." During these words, Agnes looked at me, as if looking for reassurance, so I nodded and smiled at her. "I agree with Agnes." Tan now also opened his mouth. "I also support different methods." "What kinds of methods, then?" Freddie inquired heatedly. "I myself see precisely two options. Either we fix this house up or not. Fixing it requires means which do not appear out of thin air, get it? Of course there are other options as well, loaning or whatever, but tell me, why shouldn't we just take the things we need from the rich businessmen, eh? It wouldn't be at all unfair. Tan just wanted to steal from his father, didn't he? Why should that be anyhow worse?" Now all we other three fell silent. For a moment, one could only hear the birdie striping out the window, But then it seemed that Agnes was reminded of something. She raised her head, looked at me again, and asked, as if speaking to some third person, "What does Maria think of all that?" You know, it has always been like this. Right from the beginning. Agnes and Freddie will argue over something, and in the end, I have to be the judge. Imagine that. At that moment, they all looked at me tensely, as if I were holding a large gavel in my hand, preparing to hit the table with it 3 times and make some great decision. But I don't like being a judge of that kind. Thus I just vaguely exclaimed that I had discussed all that with Fred before. "When? What did you discuss?" Agnes now demanded, with her eyes large and round. "Before. And all that. Just casually. You know, theoretically." Then the girl's face turned so incredulous that it just made me snicker. "By God, it was just talk," I explained through the laughter. "But still, I can't say I'm completely against that idea, because actually, if you think about it, there is something to it. Think of all the anarchists, dissidents, and insurrectionists, all those that have smashed luxury shops or built barricades, resisted swarms of cops with their full force during uprisings or just in the name of their ideals. Do all of them also deserve our contempt? But that's another matter completely." "Why? Why is that different?" "The difference is that those rebels have never smashed anything for their own profit. On the contrary, they rebel because of their ideals. For example, that the luxury shops are profiteering off misery and poverty, that they're splitting society, that they're nurturing materialism." "Fair enough," Freddie interrupted, "but tell me, did we come here to make profit? Did we exchange the whole damn petty bourgeois ideal against that dilapidating hovel just to earn some kind of personal profit? I wouldn't say so at all." Agnes stared straight ahead, with a sour face, and without saying anything. Tan scratched his nape and was somehow lost in thought. Our bunch was rather used to such moments of silence. Sometimes you just have to give a person time to think, and you should give them a lot of it. So no one made a sound. The silence in the room was absolute, when all of a sudden, something horrible happened. Exactly next to us, someone started beating the house wall with a hellish determination, especially fast and especially hard. Like some kind of a maniac, they beat and they beat as if they wanted to gnaw themselves through the wall and then through our skulls straight to our brains. Jeez, it was awful. Freddie grabbed Agnes and Tan and threw himself on me. Must have thought they were shooting or God knows what, pulling us all on the floor with an awful thud. After that, it fell silent for a bit behind the wall, but then the noise started again. So Agnes pressed her hands to her ears with a wince and moaned. The noise reached us. Dunn reached his head from under Fred's arm to peek at the window, and imagine that. There was a little, snappy, red, black, white-bristled bird clinging to the trunk of a pine that stood right next to the house and beating on the soft, thick bark of the tree with its full force. "A woodpecker," Dunn stated matter-of-factly. He is a bit of a bird enthusiast. Then cleared his throat and added, even more calmly, more precisely, the most genuine, lesser spotted woodpecker. Now we also lifted our noodles and shamefully turned to look at the little bird, while the latter still hammered on the wood with undisturbed ease. Truly, it was a woodpecker, and it really did make such terrible noise. "Must be looking for pine beetles, but it is strange for it to do it so close to the city center," Dunn mumbled to himself, and started laughing then. We all did, but regrettably so thoughtlessly that even during our first hass, the little woodpecker lifted its head, warbled, and fluttered its wings with a start. The next moment, in the air, then gone. It was a really nice little bird, which we saw several times later also. Finally, we named it Black Falcon, after an American Indian chief, because, you know, that chief and his people could raise such a powerful war cry that the whites would flee just due to the screaming, honestly. What a coward I am, Agnes snickered, when we'd finally untangled ourselves from the human bundle and rubbed our hands and legs, which were all a bit bruised from the falling. And an even worse urbanite. Can't even recognize a woodpecker. Thinks it's a war or invasion or who knows what. Oh my. That's not right, really. Good that we at least have Tun. In him, something of the true person is left. And he at least recognizes the world. The rest of us are altogether total technocrats. Although we don't want to be. Seems like that darn city has robbed us of our last crumbs of reason. After those words, Agnes paused and chewed a bit on her crocodile's nails and said, "Well, I think you are right, Freddie and Maria. I think we truly could rob some back for ourselves, in the end. A lot more has been taken from us, and our trouble is also rather great." Tun listened to Agnes in silence, with his head down. But when she finished, he also lifted his eyes and nodded. "Yes," he said, "stealing for personal gain is one thing, but out of real needs and principles, another. And we would only be taking from the rich. Exactly like—" He smirked, blinked an eye with extreme deviousness, and went on. "Just like Robin Hood, as it is us that are poor. Ain't it so? So this way, it would be a completely honest sharing." It became apparent that none of us had backed down from our words. Within 2 days, we struck through a chilling March night onto a building site Freddie had told us about. He had happened upon it completely by accident and claimed that it had some kind of a shed-like building or something. The lot was bordered by a high fence, and in its street side end there was some man in a little booth. A so-called guard, but he didn't seem to do much but drink. At least, that's what we hoped. But when we circled around it, we found an especially dark corner, which was even shaded by a few trees. There were 3 of us there, because Tun stayed at home to avoid excessive crowding. At first it was Agnes that was to stay behind, as she was so tiny and weak, but she had meanwhile gone full fervor and categorically resisted being left out of play. As soon as we crossed the fence, we ran hunchedly towards the little house shrouded in darkness, whose door was, as it became apparent, locked. So Freddie shoved an iron bar he had taken with him for this very purpose under the padlock, and started prying. Once, twice, 3 times. Silence and fear. But on the 4th try, the padlock fell off with a crunch. We snuck in, and Agnes lit the way with a flashlight, opening our eyes to a filler keg, nail jars, and even some tools. But by God, our hands were shaking so fiercely that grasping for the stuff took great effort, and it was all thrown into our backpacks with disorder. A handful of filler, another one of nails, and so on. In the end, we heard a cracking noise from the yard and ran to the fence completely recklessly, without any sense of direction, without thinking of any guards or booths, conquering the fence in mere seconds despite our heavy bags. Jeez, how we ran. It was as if someone had shouted something at us, but it might have also been mere imagination. We ran so hard we were almost out of breath. Only when we made it to the street of our house did we finally slow our pace and fall on the pavement, uncaring of its icy coldness. The sky was completely clear, and we even saw a few stars there, although most of them were lost in the city glow, when Freddie sat up all of a sudden and shouted, "We did it! Imagine that! We did it! We'll show them yet!" He was completely out of it, and it seemed to me that his screams would echo to even the end of the world, so I almost shoved my hand into his mouth, hissing, "Shut up, why don't you?" But Freddie didn't make nothing of it, just freed himself and laughed all over the street, all over the city, his roaring laughter. In the end, me and Agnes had naught else to do but join the mad laughter, cursing and yelling, "We did it! We'll show them! Ha! We're the most powerful! You hear this? The most powerful!" And so on, until a light shone up in one of the ghost house's windows, and we jumped up with a scare to run home. Yes, absolutely and certainly, to our own home, because there was no other name for that house anymore.